had a happy, healthy holiday season. We've got a fresh set of episodes on deck for the coming months that I hope will be both entertaining and helpful to all of our listeners, including all of you emerging writers and MFA applicants. Recently, one listener, Jenna Lee, wrote a review of our show on Apple Podcasts that says, "Insightful and compelling. I appreciate how Jared takes great inventory of applicants' needs and interests with each interview. I found this podcast insightful and have enjoyed the all-around compelling conversations with a range of guests." So I just wanted to say thank you to Jenna. I appreciate you listening and taking the time to write a review of the show. These reviews help more people find the podcast, and for those of us on the podcast team, they help brighten our day. So thank you so much. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms, or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Jason Rodriguez. Jason is a second-year MFA in writing student focusing on design, interactivity, and poetry at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's been a producer on the school's podcast, SAIC Beat, for the last 3 seasons. He's been an assistant poetry editor for the journal Anomaly, and recently worked on a queer sci-fi stop-motion short film titled Mother Bunker, which played at the Ann Arbor Film Festival, Outfest, and Melbourne International Film Festival. His writing has been published in places like Glitter Mob, Mannequin House, Word for Word, and Gasher, and was included as the introduction to Michael Aurelio's poetry collection, The Smokers. Today, he's brought 3 short pieces to read for us.
So these pieces are kind of like visual pieces, so this first one is going to be in an upcoming issue for Bathhouse Journal, which is very exciting. Joan Cusack smiles, and I hear morning traffic, 7 Texan, like, shouldn't my half-lit gills of silence, somewhere in New England, somewhere in that simple sugar Sisyphus, bejeweled sinus of inflection, sliding up the staircase as some procession of language inflate. Giovanni Ribisi looks at me as if I'm James Holden, as if I'm meeting Freckles in the bathroom, jotting down footsteps, embraced weather in his pocket, drinking with my left hand in that commotion of humor. He'll buy me a hairline someday. In the giblets of my mind, his fingers watching Hassan laugh awkward text to co-workers, tasting detergent again. Give me an eyelid to remember why I'm low after 8:05. And then this next one. I'm an afternoon handshake, bowing between windows, posting up-to-date psychology, his visual, contemporary, carousel commentary. Drink some water, please, Demi. The milieu is wanting. And then bustle of eyelids, sweating in the plaid onslaught of character, feeding a thin night at the new Sen, tucking T-shirts into my Wi-Fi overalls, cooing feral sips of Cabernet, blessed with convenience fees, eating through a left-hand famine.
Thank you, Jason, for reading those, and thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Well, as you mentioned, these are really visual pieces, right? And like that's the first thing that jumped out to me when I read them was the visual nature of them. It's a thing that you call tile poems, and obviously our listeners can't see them when they're just listening to this episode. So I was hoping you could describe them in some way, if that's possible, and talk a bit about how you came up with this idea for the tile poems.
Yeah, so it's essentially a bunch of grid poems that I'm just kind of calling them tile poems. And their inspiration kind of like they're influenced by the flip-flap boards. So those, when you would go to like an airport in like way back when, I don't know if I'm even old enough to have seen it, but you go to an airport, you go to like a train station and have these like boards that would have, all the locations and departure times. And the idea was to kind of have that grid system and then kind of capture that motion of them flapping and flipping. So a lot of the texts are overlaid. They're sort of muddled. And it's almost as if they're captured by like a slow shutter speed of like a camera. So everything is kind of just sort of washed out a little bit, I think is what I would call it.
It's like kind of hazy in a way, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yes.
There's kind of this like, I don't know. It's like your eyes have to adjust to the poems in a way as your mind is like adjusting to the words. It's kind of an interesting effect that they have on a reader, I think. And, and you told me before the interview that your writing has fallen into a concern with the run-on sentence, particularly with the inner monologue in mind. And I think this plays off of that idea of like, it's like your eyes are trying to catch up with the words that they're seeing while your mind is trying to catch up with this sentence that's like running on and on. So what is it about the run-on sentence and the idea of the inner monologue that you find interesting and inspiring? And what ways do you think the tile form aids in that exploration?
Well, that's really fantastic question, I guess. So I was working first in a sort of more traditional concrete poetry, sort of like standard, if I dare even say that, geez. But so when you think of like concrete poetry, right, you think of like what was happening maybe in like the 50s and 60s, and you think of like, that futura sort of text or very simple text and very simplistically designed in a way that, is accessible and it's easy to read. And what I was discovering in my writing is that I was moving away from that. And it was more interested in this sort of like onslaught of image and sound and motion and movement. And I was still very much fascinated with continuing with this visual sort of scheme. And I was wondering what sort of avenue could I take to kind of join it all together? Because what I was doing before wasn't really working with the concerns I had. So I started thinking of grids as a way to sort of confine the language, to kind of encase it, and in a way where the run-on sentence wouldn't sort of be limited by the expectation of the line, I guess. Because when you just see like a block of text and it just keeps going and on and on and on, it almost feels like it has no motivation. So the idea was trying to find a way to motivate the text to continue forward.
Yeah, I think that idea of like the onslaught of language and images is interesting. And I wonder if it's, is it something about this present moment that has created that idea for you that you're trying to explore, like something cultural? I mean, we're talking about, you're using like this tile form that, your reference was these like airport tiles, which I know exactly what you're talking about. These like departure arrival tiles that would flip and say like, that a flight was on time or delayed or whatever. I remember I've seen them from movies, right?
Yeah, of course. That's honestly probably where they stem from for me.
Right,
to be honest.
Right. But so that's like like a past cultural reference. But then you move into the present moment where, I don't know about you, I feel constantly in this onslaught of images and words that are constantly being fed to me through our technology. And I wonder, like, are those two things kind of coming together for you? Is that like motivating you in some way?
No, obviously. I mean, like, you can't not be influenced by what's happening around us all the time. I mean, it's a question I always have for my own work too, is like what the objective of like visual poetry or visual writing in sort of this era where it's this era of just the image-based culture. I guess I have noticed a change in my writing over the past several years, like so many people. A lot of the writing that I was doing pre-pandemic was very observational. And, I loved going out and I loved going to like bars and just watching people and jotting down things and just kind of like combining those ideas together. And then when you're kind of just like stuck in a place and you're just stuck with yourself in your own mind, I mean, I suppose that certainly influenced the emphasis on the inner monologue, because that's kind of all I have right now. That's kind of all any of us really have in some way, because, maybe some of us are in person in some areas or not, but this time has really been really isolating for so many of us. And I suppose it does certainly fall into the areas that I'm concentrating on, definitely.
we're simultaneously super isolated in these moments, but also living in this time period in which we're streaming things into our home. We're getting constant alerts on our phone. So we're still constantly like being bombarded by these images and these ideas, even though we're like stuck in our homes. So
I think bombardment is like the perfect word for that. And you know, I think it's also just anxiety, to be honest. Like it just the past few years that just my anxiety has just gone up, and so has, I guess, my writing and how it just wants to jump. It doesn't care where it leaps to. It's just trying to find that conclusion of this thought that just began with a simple idea, you know, like Joan Cusack's smiles, or, you know, I'm a handshake, or like it's trying to navigate itself to its proper conclusion. And for me, when my thoughts are always racing, and it's just all these different hinges that just keep coming and going. And eventually I just find that endpoint, I suppose. And I guess that's reflected in my writing.
Yeah, I think it comes through really well. I think, you know, a lot of us have dealt with anxiety over the past year and a half, 2 years. And if we were dealing with it before, it's just only heightened over the last couple of years, right? And so I think that it is really interesting what you're doing. You're kind of channeling that anxiety into the visual representation of these poems. It's interesting. And you not only write, but you also work in visual mediums, having studied film at Cal Arts. So after reading your poems, I couldn't help but feel that those interests were kind of coming together in the pieces. Like, people don't usually think of writing as a visual art form, but you seem to be challenging that notion. So in what ways do you see your interests in visual art inspiring or transforming your writing, or vice versa?
Oh, 100% cinema influences where I'm at today. You know, I started writing through cinema, like way back when, writing like little like silly screenplays as a child. And, you know, when I went to Cal Arts, you know, I went in there thinking that I would do like directing and blah, blah, blah. But I soon discovered and found myself doing like weird video art, and it just eventually kind of culminated and combined itself into like poetry, like video sort of poetry. And, you know, one of the projects I did there was I co-founded we called it a multimedia poetry collective, with my good friends Michael Aurelio and Johanna Deeb, and we did like a 3-part video installation spoken word thing. And I think at that moment when that was done, I kind of realized I could do more with this visual method than I was doing prior. And so it kind of moved away from the page into like the screen. And then I kind of stumbled back into the page for a second, I guess, because I thought I could do like this performance stuff. And I realized the performances I was doing weren't necessarily being represented on the page. So I guess I went back into how can I view the page as a sort of like a screen or like a performance venue, I guess. And I guess that's how I sort of found my way into more visual writing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And you told me before the interview that you see poetry as the sister art of cinema. So what is it about these two mediums that you think are similar? And in what ways do you think about and utilize those similarities in your own work?
Of all the arts, I really do see poetry and cinema just hand in hand. I think with poetry, you tell stories, but you're also presenting stories, I think. And cinema is, it is a storytelling method, but it's also presenting stories through a perspective, through a POV. It is also there are two art forms that deal heavily with image, with sound, with motion, with movement, in a way that I feel like perhaps other mediums aren't necessarily on the same wavelengths. And maybe that's just me. That's probably just me. But it's also coming from, a background in film where I write in a way where I'm sort of putting together puzzles. So I'm constantly writing down ideas, sort of fragments, phrases, words. And, I'll start with, one idea, like Joan Cusack smiling. And then I'll start piecing these other sounds and the other's motivations sort of together. And in a way, it's almost, for me, it's like editing. It's like editing a film. It's like taking different sections and kind of combining them together. But I view language, each word is, for me, like a frame. There's 24 frames, 27, 30, whatever it is. You're just adding more frames. So as you build it, you're creating like these seconds and these moments. And that's how I see, I guess, my writing, as this build up to one image. Like I said before, this build up to like this conclusion.
Yeah, that ties into the idea of the tile poems too, right? Where you're putting like each letter into essentially a frame, and those frames are adding up to make words and sentences and images and feelings.
Correct. Yeah, I agree with that 100%.
And you mentioned editing film and the relationship to writing poetry. Before the interview, you had mentioned this film editing principle that I had never heard of. It's called the Kuleshov effect. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and how you think that relates to writing and revising poetry.
Yeah, so that effect, it's essentially just, say you have an image of a man sitting in a chair, and then you cut to an image of a baby crying. And then you go back to the same man sitting in that same chair, and you cut to, a woman singing on a stage. The way that it's cut together, the man and the baby, the man and the woman, there's going to be a different emotional sort of outcome that the audience or the viewer is going to experience from that connection. And that's kind of how I see language and words acting. Like what emotion, what sort of action, what sort of motivation can we stumble into through these combinations of sounds and words and images? Like, where can we go? And where does this lead? Essentially, is what I'm asking constantly. Where does this go?
Yeah, and I imagine when you're revising your poems, thinking like, okay, well, if I put this word here or this sentence here after this sentence, how does that change the feeling? How does that change the meaning of this thing that I'm writing?
Correct. Yeah.
I like that idea. I like that idea of, letters being frames of film, but also like words being essentially scenes, or sentences being scenes maybe, and how you arrange them and the order you put them in can completely change the meaning and the feeling of a piece. Right now, you told me you're currently working on a hybrid poem that utilizes the screenplay form. So it sounds like you're continuing to probe that boundary between cinema and literature. Could you tell us a bit about that project?
Yeah, so it's a weird, silly little project that I've been working on kind of on and off for a while. For some time now, I've been experimenting with just like the idea of the scene header. In a screenplay, you have a scene header. It's, it's like interior bedroom night, and I was experimenting with the idea of like the scene header as a poem, and then what follows sort of like, the extension of it. And I was just doing little sections of it. And then that expanded into a project I did my first semester at SAIC, where I did a sort of like a permutation poem, permutation screenplay, infinite screenplay, I think I called it, where you would take like a quarter of a page, and it was like a website that every 15 seconds it would change into like a different sort of screenplay piece. I guess from that piece, I was just more fascinated with what else I could do with the screenplay.
You told me that you view the page, whether that be the physical page or beyond, as a performance venue rife with interactive opportunities. So maybe this is a chance to expand on that idea a little bit related to the screenplay. I'm curious if you have ideas for ways in which that screenplay project you're working on could become something more interactive or visual that you work on beyond the page.
Sure. I guess when I say interactive, right? Like I don't know if it means. That's a question I'm still stumbling in. I don't know if it means like interactive in the way that you can like physically like touch it and feel it or move it, or if it's interactive in that I'm demanding or, requesting the reader to participate. I mean, that's kind of like the language poets, right? Like their whole system, which they were highly criticized on, was like, trying to motivate the reader to be active participants. The art that I appreciate, it goes back to cinema too, is ones that demand the audience or the viewer to participate in some way, or to recognize the actual fact of viewing or reading. I think one of the the director that everyone probably loves is Godard. Like he did things with cinema to kind of like demand your attention to the fact that you were watching a film. And I guess that's kind of what I'm trying, what I'm aiming for in this project is sort of that request, and that the balance of that request, and figuring out how to navigate that, I suppose.
Well, it sounds very postmodern, right? I mean, this is like what most maybe you don't want to be called postmodern. No. But I mean, this is what they were concerned with, right? Like they wanted to point out the fact that like a story was doing something. They wanted their reader to be aware that they were a participant in the thing that they were reading, right?
Yes. And I guess so many people don't. I feel like a lot of people are hesitant to be active participants, right? Like, how do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, maybe it goes back to what we were talking about related to this cultural moment where we're constantly intaking information. Like we're just bombarded with information, visuals, words, and we're intaking so much that and the pandemic, I think, has exacerbated this. We don't have as much opportunity to interact. There's not interaction with those things. It's just intake. And I think, just like talking about anxiety, it's a cycle, right? You get used to thinking a certain way, and then it compounds and you keep thinking that same way. And so if you're constantly being bombarded with images and information and just taking that stuff in without interacting with it, you get out of practice in a way. It feels uncomfortable to interact.
Yeah. No, it does. It does. I think that's a beautiful way to put it, actually. I don't disagree with any of that.
So I wonder if, it seems to me that pushing the reader to interact with the poetry, or pushing the reader to interact with the stuff that you're writing, is an important endeavor right now, because at some point I'd like to think this pandemic will end and we will go back to some world in which it seems normal again, right? In which we can be around people without like a baseline level of anxiety. So we're going to have to learn how to interact with one another again. So maybe that's going to be a project in art during this moment and after this moment's over, to get us interacting again, getting us talking about what we feel when we're reading something.
I think so. I think, what I'm noticing here is, at SAIC, we're still, this is my first semester in Chicago. I was studying remotely in LA last year. And, I was excited. When we came back this last semester, I think a lot of us were, we're like, we're at the end. It's near the end. We can start getting together. We can do things. And I think, we're still, what I noticed is that not everyone was ready and not everyone was prepared. And maybe it is influencing the way that we are interacting with what we consume. And hopefully, after all of this is said and done, we will find a way to challenge that interaction that we've been having.
Well, I think being aware of those kind of constraints that have been put on us and how those are affecting us and the way we interact with people is an important thing to keep in mind when we're creating. I think it's an interesting thing to probe. And you brought up the program SAIC. I want to talk about this program a bit. It's an MFA in writing program at the School of the Arts Institute in Chicago. It's a 2-year program that, according to the website, provides a rigorous yet flexible curriculum to challenge and accommodate individual explorations of process and form. You told me that the program doesn't rely on the typical genre tracks in poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. So what does SAIC do differently?
Yeah. So what when I was applying to school, this round, SAIC was literally my top choice because of the fact there weren't tracks. When I was looking into programs, because I was working in a visual medium in a way, I was working with like concrete poetry. That was what I, submitted as my, my portfolio. I wasn't sure where I would necessarily fit. Like, obviously it's poetry, but it has, is it poetry? So I was looking for places that would allow me, this ability to investigate other areas of writing without being constrained or confined to one particular track. Because I obviously have interest in screenwriting, I have interest in poetry, I have an interest in sort of visual stuff. So I didn't want to feel limited by that. And so what I think SAIC does is that it emphasizes that individuality and of just the demand of the individual wanting to scope out their surroundings. And as a result, we get a lot of really interesting work from a variety of different writers. We have playwrights, we have poets, we have fiction, nonfiction, memoirists, we have sequential artists, comics. It's lovely to be able to engage with so many different ideas in a classroom setting, because it opens up your mind and it opens up, the way that you look at writing. Perhaps some of the things that I said earlier in our conversation, maybe I wouldn't have said that had I not been, brought to the attention of some of the interest of other people. When you're in a field that's just like one mindset, I feel like it might be difficult to not question, but kind of like, look beyond see your peripheries. And here you have that ability to see the peripheries and to engage with it if you so please. So I think was, is what's really fascinating about the program.
So I imagine that means that you're taking a lot of classes with people who are doing completely different things than you, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I'm in classes with, like I said, playwrights. I'm in classes with, comic book, sequential graphic novel artists, poets, obviously, people who are working on their, this large, extensive projects, whether it's like fiction or nonfiction. So and when you come to the workshops, you get to experience all of those different fields, and so it's so lovely to be able to jump between mediums or genres and to like really question sort of how you, maybe you're not maybe you don't have like that background in nonfiction. Like I didn't really have a background in nonfiction, but because of, the community, I've been able to engage with that in a way that I'm like, maybe there's something I could possibly do with this at some point. And now I'm taking that and I'm like, okay, how can I insert that maybe in the screenplay thing? How can I create sort of a non-fiction approach to screenwriting, if that makes any sense? Let's wander into that for a while. So, I mean, that's what excites me. And that's what excited me about the program.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I really can't imagine being in a workshop where people are doing like completely different things. I mean, the typical idea of a workshop is I write fiction. I'm in a room with people who write fiction and we're focusing on how to improve a piece of fiction, right? Because we're all trying to do that in our own work. So it sounds like you've identified a lot of benefits of being in the classroom with people who are doing lots of different things. Are there any drawbacks at all to being in a workshop with people who maybe aren't writing poetry or aren't writing visual poetry like you're writing?
I think that's a really good question. And, an honest answer would be that, sometimes because there is, because we're not all familiar with different things, we have to explain ourselves a bit. But once that explanation is set, once you have said like, this is my visual field, this is my visual influence, this is where I'm coming from, and you have that language, that sort of vocabulary to bounce off of, then the workshop is no different from a poetry workshop I had, in my undergrad. It's the same thing. But what's different is that you have all these different experiences coming in, that challenge and allow you to experiment.
So I'm curious what the actual workshop looks like then, because in the typical workshop, you present a piece of work, you don't talk, you sit there, you're silent, and you listen to people talk about it.
Yeah.
Is that what they're doing at SAIC? Or are you like allowed to have a conversation about the work that you're workshopping since people are on different pages?
No, I honestly, it just depends on the instructor. You know, like in some classes, you know, there's one class we called it, you know, we called it the woodshed, where we would, you know, shed out whatever. You know, some instructors say, you know, you have to be quiet and you have to listen to feedback. But most of the time, you know, it's art school, right? Like we're all really opinionated, right? So like, you know, that silence it might last a couple of responses, and then, you know, you gotta engage, like you have to respond. So it's not quite so strict. But because of that, it's more freeing, I feel, because I you know, that's one of the dilemmas I had when I was looking at schools, and, you know, obviously that sort of traditional workshop where you sit there and you just take it all, you know, it just felt really, it didn't feel inspiring. And you know, it's art school, so what's freeing about it is the ability to kind of just like speak your mind and be free, I guess. So to answer your question, no, it's not like that at all, which is exciting.
Yeah, that is exciting. I think it's great. I mean, I do think that, and I don't want to generalize, but I guess for me, I've found that like the silencing workshop has helped me, or did help me to a certain point in my progress as a writer. And now I'm reaching that point where it's like, I'm not sure sitting there in silence is really helping me that much. And I wish I had an opportunity to have a more interactive conversation about the work that I'm presenting in workshop. So it's nice that you have like some flexibility there. And it sounds like some professors are doing it different ways than others. So you can get a feel for both ways. Yeah.
So how does it work for you all? Like, do you just sit there and then you get like 10 minutes to respond to each one? Is that how it works kind of?
Well, again, it depends on the professor, right? So most of our classes are like, most of them are like 3 hours long. Like we meet once a week, and we'll have like 3 pieces that we will workshop. So we get like sometimes like 40 to 45 minutes on each one. But yeah, we send out the story the week before, our classmates read it, and then we sit there in silence as they discuss it. And then at the end of the workshop, we have a chance to like speak, ask questions, comment on things they said. But for the most part, we're silent during it.
Oh wow, yeah, that'd be a struggle for me, I think. Like,
it is sometimes.
It's just a struggle for me to not say something.
Yeah, it is.
Excuse me, I have something to say. No, that's yeah. I guess for me, it felt right, you know, the way it's going. But like I said before, all the instructors are quite different. They do it their own way. It's just about, you know, I think what's really cool is that the instructors really feel out sort of the room and where everyone's coming from, and they kind of guide the process through that.
That's great. Yeah, it really, there's so much importance with the workshop facilitator, right? With the instructor being able to read the room, like you said, and figure out where to move the conversation. So what have been some of your favorite classes at SAIC?
The first class I signed up for was the Oulipo class with Beth Nugent. I think it was the first class I knew I was going to take. I had some experience with like reading some Oulipian, I think I'm saying that right, Oulipian writers, but it was so interesting to kind of dive into this. I don't want to call it a movement. I guess it's definitely still around, but this sort of program of thought, I suppose, of writing.
I think that there's probably a lot of listeners who might not know what Oulipo is. So maybe you could explain that a little bit and then talk about your experience in the class.
Yeah, sure. So Oulipo is, to very much simplify it, please, is sort of a group of writers who work within constraints of writing. So instead of going in and, you know, knowing what they kind of like, instead of going in with like a story and whatever, they go in with a problem. They create the problem for themselves. They create the constraint, and they work within that to discover. And that's what's really fascinating about them. And in that class is what we did. You know, we would have weekly assignments where we would write like lipograms, which is a kind of constraint where you're, you know, you're avoiding a certain letter in the alphabet, or a univocalism where you're just using only one vowel, and you're just writing with that one. So you're writing with A, E, whatever, and the things that would show up, like, so, sometimes it's hard. It's really hard to write within a constraint, especially when you only have like a week to figure it out and like to needle it through. But that class has, everyone in that class has gone on to carry something over into all of their work that I've seen, whether it's whatever they're working on for their thesis or just their smaller program, the smaller little projects, For me, I carry that over into that screenplay. I have a section in the screenplay where the constraint was every sentence. It's not the hardest constraint, but every sentence had to start with like the letter A. And the attempt is to disguise it so you don't clue in the reader necessarily, but they're still seeing it. And it eventually becomes its own sort of rhythm and pattern and movement. And but that's like me. But I also there's one project we did in the class. We did like a prose sestina, which where we had to, a sestina, you take, you have to end a line, certain words, whatever. And there was one word that we used in that project that I've carried over into almost every other little project that I've used. And it's always turned into something interesting. So that class was a highlight for me. Yeah.
And it seems like there are various opportunities outside of the classroom to get involved around campus within the program at SAIC. And it sounds like you've taken advantage of some of those, including for the last 3 seasons, working as a producer on the school's F News magazine podcast, SAIC Beat. What's that experience been like?
Yeah, SAIC Beat is I'm really I'm excited to be a part of it. I knew as soon as I got into SAIC, I wanted to be part of the paper, the school student paper, which is F News magazine, which is lovely and very progressive. They do really incredible stories. And I noticed that they had a podcast. And so I just applied thinking, maybe I'll get it. And I had a lovely interview, and I got on board. And the first 2 seasons I worked with MFA in New Arts Journalism, Olivia Canny, who really, she taught me everything about podcasting, because I came in without a background in journalism, right? Like I didn't, I was just like, I listen to podcasts, maybe I can figure this out. And, we each season we come up with an idea of like a theme. So that first season I worked on, we had the theme of forgiveness and permission, right? And so we talked to, the first episode I worked on, which, it sold me on working in podcasts, was with an instructor. I believe her name was Nicole Marroquin. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sorry. And we talked about, the Chicano and Black student uprisings in Chicago. And, I did the audio for that, and it was like I did audio before, but it was just so exciting to kind of combine all these things that I had in my, like, what I guess I didn't realize I had in my pocket, like, and create sort of a sonic story. And we've gone on to do other, like the 5th season, we touched on like gender and sex work at SAIC. The 6th season, which we just finished, was a little bit more lighter. We talked about, what students are doing like outside the school. And, each season there's something new to experience and to investigate, which is really exciting.
So outside of the podcast, are there other ways that MFA students get involved with F News magazine?
Yeah, you can apply to be like an editor of one of their sections, art, news, comics, etc. Or you can just be a contributing writer. Like that's how I kind of started. Like when I started, I applied as just I applied for the editor position in the literary section, and eventually I fell into the podcasting one. I kind of was like, well, I'm applying for this, but I really want the podcast, which I was really thankful for. And so they usually test you out with like a little test article that they'll either publish in the paper if they have space or online. And, I believe I wrote an article on voting because the election was coming up 2020, and just, the direction of millennials and Gen Zers and please go out and vote. And here's how you can access voting, please. So, and that was really exciting to do that. Yeah.
So additionally, you've been a TA since your first semester and have worked closely with students on intro to writing courses and a BFA writing thesis class. And since then, you've also become a tutor at the school's writing center. So what have these experiences been like?
They've been amazing. I mean, like I one of the things I wanted to really concentrate on is getting my hands on teaching and sort of what that means, like what is pedagogy essentially, So I applied for a TA position thinking that, I might not really have a chance because I didn't really have any background in teaching. I just had all this experience in film and as like this, like a assistant editor and some like weird stuff. But the experience was, the intro to writing was my first one. And what I discovered was that I really loved working with others through the process of their writing and the process of their editing, So like, I kind of already knew that because as a producer on a film, just depending on what kind of producer you are, you're working really closely with, the creators to kind of, foment or build up the what will become the iota of the idea, right? And as a TA, I discovered that was sort of a transferable interest. And, sitting down with students and one-on-one, sitting down one-on-one with students like after class and just talking about their process and where they can go, like why this line isn't, maybe you should consider this or that. I don't know, it gives me like so much like weird thrill, and just to know that I can it's weird, it's sick. Just to know that I could help guide them. And I think that's what I love doing is I really love the process of guiding someone, seeing what they're aiming for, seeing what that aim is, that achievement, and not taking like my own biases into it and just going, okay, I see what you're doing. Now let's kind of scope this out. Let's see how we can move this here. How can we take this essential part and let it bloom? That's what's really exciting for me about TAing. And when I was doing the BFA thesis class, that was super intense because these are all like last year BFA students who are fantastic writers. And really, super intimidating. And, you're working with them one-on-one on their poetry or their fiction. And their end was to have a collection, either of a collection of poetry or a long form sort of collection of short story, or like a longer fiction piece that they'll go on to do. And just, there's a moment when you're working with a student and you suggest something, and then several weeks go by, and then suddenly you're reading their work and we're having workshop, and you're like, oh wow, that one little tidbit of thing that I kind of threw out there is like it has somehow bloomed into like this wonderful thing.
My background's in teaching, so I totally understand what you're saying. It is a really special feeling. So in general, how do these TA positions work? Are you applying for them each year? Are these things that you get awarded when you apply for the program? How does that work?
Oh, that's a good question. No, that's a really good question. It's something you apply for each semester. So unlike some programs where I think I know what you're talking about, you get funding through TAing. You do get funding, like you do get paid for the TA-ship here. But it's something you apply for every semester. It's not something that's guaranteed.
And what does that funding look like? Is it you're getting paid like a monthly stipend? Are you getting any tuition remission, anything like that?
You're getting paid hourly. So you're getting paid hourly for the work that you do. And
so TA positions, writing center, do you have a sense of like other kind of funding opportunities for if people are considering going to SAIC to study in the MFA, like ways that they could get funding while they're there?
Yeah, there's so many opportunities. I mean, you can, it's not just the writing center or the TA ships, there's like a media center you can work at. You can work in the library. There's little jobs and little places that you can like wedge yourself in, the printmaking shop, and you can find little jobs where they will help you out.
After the interview, Jason asked me to clarify a bit on funding. He said the school and the program do offer alternative funding through either grants or scholarships. One person per cohort is awarded full funding, and from his understanding, there's a decent proportion of students who are awarded grants and/or scholarships to assist their education. Jason said in his experience, the program and school will certainly go out of their way to try and accommodate your needs. And you told me before the interview that combined working for F News Magazine and TAing, you've had the chance to get immersed into the larger SAIC community. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the general vibe and community within the program and the school.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because the past, I got into school during the beginning and height of COVID. Like I said before, I was studying remotely my first year in LA. So for me, my introduction to the community was engaging as much as possible through these opportunities, whether it's through F News and the podcast, whether it's TAing for that first year. And then when I moved out here, I was able to kind of get classes were a bit more in person. You get to get a better sense of how people are. I mean, it's an art school, it's a class, I won't call it classic art school, but it's art school. It's art school in that, it's going to be a very inviting, safe place for you to engage in, most anything your mind wants to. And if you have an idea, if you have like a thought, for a project, there are opportunities for you to potentially get funding for those projects as well. So it's all really, really creative, to say the least.
Creative and welcoming. That sounds great. And you mentioned that you were coming from LA, but now you're in Chicago. So how are you handling those winters?
Oh my man, it's 16 degrees today. It is 16. I don't know what this is. I love Chicago. Chicago is a beautiful city. It's a real city. I don't know if you've been to LA, but if anyone has been to LA, it is a collection of lovely neighborhoods, right? And you have to drive 3 hours to just go 2 miles. So what I love about Chicago is that I can actually use the metro, right? And it takes me somewhere. I get on, and 10 minutes later, I am somewhere close to my destination. Arguably, some people have, different opinions on that, but I feel pretty secure in that opinion. But, you walk around, there's these monoliths, the buildings that are just kind of like surrounding you. That's what I wanted. That's what I needed. That's what I love about Chicago. And the people are really lovely. They're it's that Midwestern kindness. It's quite different from LA, sure. If I miss anything, I miss the desert. I'm constantly thinking of, we would go out to Joshua Tree, at least twice a year. And, I miss that. I miss that desperately. But I have lovely, lovely scenery around me here. So.
Well, before we go, I want to give you the last word. So what I usually ask guests is to tell me one thing they think the program does really well and one way in which they think the program can improve.
Yeah. So what I think the program does really well is that it really captures the essence of whatever you're proposing to do. It really strives to allow you to succeed in whatever capacity that is, whether, whatever genre that is, whatever you're sort of in the middle of discovering and finding and navigating. So I've had classes where, the final projects are ranged from a collection of poetry to someone's video performance, I've been able to work in weird hypertext and do some like weird AR work where I work, I'm learning code and I'm trying to figure it out. I mean, I'm just kind of learning, and I create like this weird AR field that I can like perform in. And, I made like this weird QR code that became part of the performance and the reading of the poem. Like, it gives you access to so much beyond, I guess, the base of just writing and text and storytelling. It asks you, and it kind of begs you to ask you for yourself, like, what is writing outside of just the page, maybe? And I think that's what's really interesting. I've had the opportunity to go to art school quite a bit in my life. And, there's art schools that are really like hippy dippy free. Like my undergrad, it was, it was just one of those like weird, fun schools. And SIC is weird and fun too. But I think there's some cases where I feel like it's a bit bureaucratic in moments, and it still works and it's still beautiful and whatever. But sometimes, at the end of the day, there's always something.
I think it's a good point to bring up. Anyone listening thinking about grad school, be ready for some bureaucracy to deal with.
I know.
I think it's present in all these programs, even though we would love to be, like just in a creative program where that stuff does not rear its head. It's going to. So get ready to deal with it. But it sounds great. SAIC, it sounds like a great school. I love, speaking of AR, hypertext, all these like interesting areas that you can explore and see how they interact with the work you're doing. And just, I imagine a good way to think about SAIC is to come in with an open mind, not knowing like exactly what your project's going to be, but like being open to being inspired to do new things. It sounds like that's been the case with you. And I'm really excited to see what you do next. And I'm really glad that you took the time to stop by and chat with me about your work. It's been a really lovely conversation.
Yeah, I know. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.